My girlfriend's sorority had a ritual of interrogating new boyfriends, and they spent 3 hours questioning my career and my worth. They all went silent when I explained who actually paid for their house. The crystal chandelier above the formal dining room cast sharp shadows across 23 faces, all of them staring at me with varying degrees of contempt and amusement. It was 7:47 p.m. on a Saturday in October when Madison's sorority president, a senior named Sloane Whitmore, with perfectly straightened blonde hair and a Cartier bracelet that probably cost more than my monthly rent, leaned back in her chair and asked me the question that made my jaw clench. "So, Jason, be honest with us. Do you really think you're good enough for Madison? I mean, you work at a hardware store. You drive a 15-year-old Camry. You live in a studio apartment above a laundromat. What exactly do you bring to this relationship besides mediocrity?" The other sorority sisters giggled, and I watched Madison's face turn red as she stared down at her perfectly manicured nails. She didn't defend me. She didn't say a word. Just sat there at the head of the table, letting her sisters tear me apart like this was normal, like this was fine, like I was supposed to just take it and prove myself worthy of dating a member of Kappa Delta Phi at the University of Southern California. I'd been dating Madison Ashford for 8 months when she finally told me about the boyfriend interrogation tradition. We met in a coffee shop near campus, where I was working a Saturday shift at the hardware store down the street, and stopped in for lunch. She was a junior studying communications, came from old money in Connecticut, and had a laugh that made me forget I was wearing a name tag that said, "Jason, here to help." We started talking about a documentary we'd both seen, exchanged numbers, went on a first date to a taco truck that she loved because it felt authentic and real. I was 26, she was 21, and I'd been working at Anderson Hardware for 3 years while figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. I had a degree in philosophy from a state school that I'd paid for myself with loans I was still paying off, lived in a 400-square-foot studio in a part of LA that real estate agents called up and coming, which meant it was cheap and slightly dangerous, and drove a 2009 Toyota Camry that had 186,000 miles on it. Madison seemed to like that I was different from the finance bros and pre-law students she usually dated. She said I was grounded and real and didn't care about superficial things. I thought she meant it. I thought she saw me for who I was and liked what she saw. The first red flag came 3 months in when she asked me not to pick her up from sorority events. She said the house had a strict rule about non-members being on the property after 10 p.m., and it was easier if she just got an Uber. I accepted that because I didn't know anything about Greek life, and it sounded plausible. The second red flag was when she started introducing me to her friends as, "Jason, he's in retail," instead of explaining I managed the hardware store, which wasn't glamorous, but was a real job with real responsibilities. The third red flag was when her parents came to visit, and she told me she had the flu and couldn't see me that weekend. Then I saw photos on Instagram of her having brunch with them at Nobu. When I asked about it, she said she didn't want to overwhelm them by introducing a boyfriend so early, and I believed her because I wanted to believe her. The fourth red flag was the interrogation itself. Madison had been nervous all week before telling me about it, and when she finally explained the tradition, she made it sound casual and silly. She said every new boyfriend had to come to a formal dinner at the sorority house and answer questions from her sisters so they could get to know him. She said it was just their way of making sure she was dating someone worthy of her, and all the guys went through it, and it was actually kind of fun and bonding. But sitting in that dining room with 23 sorority sisters arranged around a table that looked like it belonged in a palace, with actual china plates and silver cutlery and a formal place setting, I didn't know how to navigate. I realized this wasn't fun or bonding or casual. This was a trial. This was them deciding whether I was good enough to date one of them, and they'd already decided I wasn't. Sloane sat at one end of the table in a black dress that probably cost what I made in a month, flanked by her vice president Aubrey Chen, whose family apparently owned half of Silicon Valley, and their social chair Tiffany Rothschild, whose last name was literally Rothschild. Madison sat at the other end, looking miserable but silent, and I was in the middle, on display, being picked apart. They started with soft questions at first. Where did I go to school? What did I study? What were my career goals? I answered honestly. State school, philosophy, still figuring it out. Worked at a hardware store while I explored options. Maybe start my own business someday. The looks they exchanged told me everything I needed to know about what they thought of those answers. Philosophy. How useful. A hardware store. How aspirational. Still figuring it out at 26. How motivated. Then Sloane started the real interrogation. She asked about my car, my apartment, my income, my family background, my 5-year plan, my investment portfolio. I didn't have one. My connections in the industry. Which industry? My prospects for advancement. She asked all of this with a sweet smile and a tone that sounded concerned, but was actually condescending. Aubrey jumped in to ask about my parents. What did they do? Where did they live? Did they belong to any clubs? Had they gone to college? I said my dad worked in property management and my mom was a teacher. They lived in Oregon. And yes, they'd gone to college. Aubrey nodded slowly, like she was processing this information and finding it wanting. Tiffany asked if I had any connections to help Madison's career after graduation. Did I know anyone in media, in entertainment, in business? Could I introduce her to anyone important? I said no, I didn't really have those kinds of connections. More pitying looks. Then another sister, Chelsea something, asked if I knew what Madison's usual type was. I said I didn't. She said Madison usually dated guys who were going places. Pre-law, pre-med, finance, guys with internships at major firms, guys whose parents had vacation homes and country club memberships, guys with futures. She let that hang in the air for a moment before asking what I thought made me different from those guys, and I realized the real question was, what made me think I was good enough when I clearly wasn't? 3 hours. They questioned me for 3 solid hours while Madison sat silent at the end of the table. They dissected my education, my job, my car, my apartment, my clothes, my shoes, my watch, a basic Timex my dad had given me for college graduation, my phone, an older iPhone model I'd bought used, my haircut, my prospects, my worth as a human being. At one point, Sloane actually asked if I'd considered that dating Madison might be holding her back from finding someone more suitable. She said it gently, like she was genuinely concerned for Madison's well-being, and I watched my girlfriend's face turn red, but she still said nothing. I kept my expression neutral and answered their questions calmly, but inside I was cataloging every insult, every smirk, every exchange of knowing glances. I was also noticing details about the sorority house itself, the massive chandelier that looked antique and expensive, the crown molding that had been recently restored, the portrait gallery in the hallway showing generations of Kappa Delta Phi sisters dating back to 1952 when the chapter was founded, the Persian rugs, the marble fireplace, the grand piano in the sitting room. The whole place reeked of money and tradition and exclusivity, and these women wore it like armor against people like me who clearly didn't belong. Around hour 2, after they'd exhausted questions about my career and finances, they moved on to cultural fit. Did I ski? No. Did I sail? No. Had I traveled internationally? A few places on budget trips. Where did I summer? I didn't summer anywhere, I worked. Did I play golf or tennis? No and no. Was I in a fraternity? No. Did I know anyone in their brother fraternity? No. The questions kept coming and my answers kept disappointing them, and Madison kept sitting there silently, and I started to wonder why I was subjecting myself to this. But I also started to get angry. These women who'd been handed everything, who'd never had to work a day in their lives for anything, were sitting in judgment of me because I'd had the audacity to earn my own way through life instead of being born into privilege. I thought about my dad who'd worked 2 jobs to put me through college. I thought about my mom who taught kindergarten for 30 years because she loved it even though it barely paid anything. I thought about every scholarship application I'd filled out, every night shift I'd worked, every time I'd eaten ramen for dinner because I was saving money for textbooks. These women knew nothing about real life, real work, real struggle, and they thought that made them better than me. At 10:38 p.m., Sloane finally asked her closing question. She leaned forward, folded her hands on the table, and said, "Jason, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you deserve honesty. We all care about Madison very much. She's a legacy member. Her mother was Kappa Delta Phi, her grandmother was Kappa Delta Phi, her aunt was chapter president in 1987. This house, this sisterhood, it means everything to our families. So I need to ask you, and please be honest, do you really think you're the right fit for someone like Madison? Someone who comes from her world? Someone who's going to move in the circles she moves in after graduation? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you two are from very different places, and I'm concerned that you might not be able to keep up with her lifestyle. I'm concerned that you might hold her back from her potential." The room went silent. All 23 sisters were staring at me, waiting for my answer. Madison was looking at her hands, her face red, tears starting to form in her eyes, but she still said nothing. She still didn't defend me. 3 hours of this, and she hadn't said a single word in my defense. I sat there for a long moment, letting the silence stretch out, and I made a decision. I was done playing their game. I was done pretending to be apologetic for not being born rich. I was done with Madison too, because anyone who would let their friends treat their partner like this wasn't someone I wanted to be with. I stood up slowly, straightened my tie, which was probably cheap by their standards but was the nicest one I owned, and looked directly at Sloane. "I appreciate your concern for Madison's well-being," I said calmly. "And you're right. We should be honest with each other. So let me be honest with you. You asked if I think I'm good enough for Madison, and the answer is yes. But I think the better question is whether Madison is good enough for me, and after watching her sit silently for 3 hours while you tore me apart, I'm starting to think the answer is no." Sloane's eyes widened slightly, and I heard a few gasps from around the table. I kept going. "You've spent the last 3 hours questioning my worth based on my job, my car, my apartment, my bank account. You've decided I'm not good enough because I work at a hardware store and drive an old car and don't belong to a country club. You think wealth and connections and the right last name are what makes someone valuable. You think being born into money makes you better than people who earn their own way." I paused, looked around the table at their shocked faces. "But here's what you don't know about me. Here's what Madison doesn't know about me either, because I never told her, because I wanted someone to love me for who I am, not what I have." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking app, the one I barely looked at because I didn't need to think about money, and I turned the screen to face Sloane. "My last name is Caldwell. My father is Robert Caldwell. He doesn't work in property management. He owns Caldwell Property Group, one of the largest commercial real estate development firms on the West Coast. My mother isn't a teacher. She was a teacher 30 years ago, before she married my dad. Now she runs the Caldwell Family Foundation, which provides scholarships to first-generation college students. I watched Sloane's face drain of color as I continued. I have a trust fund that's worth more money than everyone at this table will earn in their lifetimes combined. I could buy a new car every week for the rest of my life and not notice the expense. I choose to work at a hardware store because I wanted to understand what it's like to earn money through actual labor instead of passive income. I choose to live in a studio apartment because I wanted to know what it's like to live on a real budget. I choose to drive an old car because I don't need to prove my worth through material possessions. The room was dead silent now. Every single person was staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to horror. I turned to look at Aubrey. You asked about my connections. My father sits on the boards of 3 Fortune 500 companies. My godfather is a federal judge. My uncle is a congressman. I didn't mention any of this because I thought it was irrelevant to whether I'm a good person or not. I shifted my attention to Tiffany. You asked about my investment portfolio. I have one. It's managed by Goldman Sachs and it's done quite well. I just don't talk about it because I don't define myself by my net worth. I looked back at Sloane, who seemed to be having trouble breathing. But here's the thing I really want you to know. This sorority house you're all so proud of, this beautiful historic building with the chandelier and the crown molding and the Persian rugs, the one that was completely renovated 5 years ago to the tune of $4.2 million, the one you all live in rent-free because your chapter is supposedly self-sustaining through alumni donations. I paused for effect. The Caldwell Family Foundation paid for that renovation, every single dollar. It's in our tax records as a charitable donation to support women's education and Greek life at USC. My mother sits on the board that approved the funding. In fact, if you look at the cornerstone outside, you'll see a small plaque that says, "Renovated through the generosity of the Caldwell Family Foundation, 2018. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear someone's breathing from across the room. Sloane looked like she might throw up. Aubrey had gone pale. Madison was staring at me with her mouth open, tears streaming down her face. I pulled out my wallet and set down one of my credit cards, a black Amex that I rarely used. This is the card linked to my trust fund. I could buy this entire sorority house right now if I wanted to. I could buy the whole block. I could probably buy out all your parents' mortgages and still have money left over. I picked the card back up and put it away. But I don't need to do any of that, because here's what I learned tonight. Money doesn't make you better than anyone else. Being born into the right family doesn't make you valuable. What makes you valuable is how you treat people, and based on what I've seen tonight, you're all worthless. I turned to Madison. We're done. You had 3 hours to defend me, and you said nothing. You sat there and let your friends humiliate me because you were too concerned about what they thought to stand up for someone you claimed to care about. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. I walked out of that dining room at 10:51 p.m., and I didn't look back. I heard shouting behind me, voices calling my name, but I just kept walking through the foyer, past the portrait gallery, out the front door with its Kappa Delta Phi letters carved into the wooden frame. My hands were shaking with adrenaline and anger and something that felt almost like satisfaction. I'd spent 3 hours being treated like garbage by people who thought their trust funds made them better than me, and I'd just destroyed their entire worldview in under 5 minutes. I got in my beat-up Camry, the one I'd bought with my own money from working 40-hour weeks at the hardware store, and I drove back to my studio apartment above the laundromat, the one I rented because I wanted to understand how most people in this country actually lived. I sat on my secondhand couch in my tiny apartment, and I felt lighter than I had in months, like I'd shed some weight I'd been carrying without realizing it. Madison had called my phone 16 times by midnight. I blocked her number. Sloane had somehow found my social media and sent me a long message apologizing profusely and saying she'd had no idea who I was and she'd never have spoken to me that way if she'd known. I blocked her too. I didn't want their apologies. I didn't want anything from people who only respected wealth and couldn't see value in a human being unless there was a dollar sign attached. The next morning, Sunday, I woke up to an email from someone named Catherine Whitmore, Sloane's mother, who apparently got my contact information from the Foundation's public directory. The email was a masterpiece of fake humility and transparent damage control. She said she'd heard about the unfortunate incident at the sorority house, that her daughter was mortified by her behavior, and that the Whitmore family had the utmost respect for the Caldwell Foundation and everything we'd done for Greek life at USC. She wanted to schedule a call with my mother to apologize personally and discuss the chapter's gratitude for our support. She mentioned several times that her family had also donated to the foundation over the years and hoped this misunderstanding wouldn't affect our relationship with Kappa Delta Phi. I forwarded the email to my mother without comment. She called me 20 minutes later laughing so hard she could barely speak. "Jason, what did you do?" she asked between laughs. I told her the whole story, every detail of the 3-hour interrogation, the questions about my worth, the looks of contempt, Madison's silence, and my final revelation. She stopped laughing. "They didn't know who you were?" she asked, her voice serious now. "You never told Madison?" I said no. I'd wanted someone to love me for who I was, not what I had. There was a long pause. "Good," she said finally. Good. I'm glad you saw her real character before it was too late. And those sorority girls, treating you like that, judging you based on your car and your job. She trailed off, and I could hear the anger in her voice. What do you want me to do about the email? I asked. Nothing, she said firmly. You don't owe those people anything. They showed you exactly who they are. Let them sit with that. But the story didn't end there. It never does when you humiliate people who think they're untouchable. By Monday afternoon, I'd gotten 3 calls from other sorority parents, 2 from Kappa Delta Phi's national organization, and 1 from the university's Greek life coordinator. Everyone wanted to apologize, to explain, to assure me that this didn't represent the values of their organization or the university. I ignored most of them, but I took the call from Dr. Patricia Nguyen, the Greek life coordinator who'd been in the position for 15 years. She sounded genuinely distressed when she asked me to explain what had happened at the Saturday dinner. I gave her the full account, 3 hours of questioning, the implications that I wasn't good enough, Madison's silence, the whole thing. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. Mr. Caldwell, she said finally, I need to tell you that this is not the first complaint we've received about Kappa Delta Phi's boyfriend interrogation tradition. In fact, we've had 3 other boyfriends file formal complaints over the past 2 years about similar treatment. We've spoken to the chapter about it, advised them that the practice was inappropriate, but they've maintained it was voluntary and social in nature, and therefore not under university jurisdiction. She paused. However, if you were willing to file a formal complaint and provide details about what happened, particularly given your family's relationship with the university and the Foundation's support of Greek life, it might carry more weight. I thought about it. I could have let it go. I'd already gotten my satisfaction from the reveal, from watching their faces as they realized they'd spent 3 hours mocking someone who could have destroyed them financially with a phone call. But then I thought about the other boyfriends who'd filed complaints, the ones who didn't have the protection of family wealth and connections, the ones who'd been humiliated and then dismissed because they weren't important enough to matter. I thought about Madison sitting silently while her friends tore me apart, and how she'd been willing to let that happen because she cared more about her social standing than about basic human decency. I thought about how many other guys they'd probably done this to, how many other relationships they'd poisoned with their toxic entitlement. I'll file the complaint, I said, and I'll provide whatever documentation you need. Dr. Nguyen sounded relieved. Thank you. This will help us address a pattern of behavior that's been ongoing for too long. I asked what would happen to the chapter. She said that depended on what the investigation uncovered, but at minimum they'd be facing serious sanctions, possibly suspension, and individual members could face disciplinary action up to and including expulsion if their behavior violated the student code of conduct. Over the next week, I was contacted by the university's Office of Student Conduct, by attorneys representing Kappa Delta Phi's national organization, and by a private investigator working for the Whitmore family who wanted to understand the full context of what had happened. I referred the investigator to my own attorney, a woman named Jennifer Torres, who handled personal matters for our family and had been doing so for 20 years. Jennifer called me after speaking with the Whitmore family's investigator, and she was angry in that cold, controlled way that meant someone had really pissed her off. They're trying to paint you as a liar, she said bluntly. They're claiming you misrepresented yourself to Madison, that you deliberately deceived her about your background, and that your revelation at the dinner was calculated to humiliate the chapter. They're suggesting you might have recorded the conversation without consent, which would be illegal in California, and they're threatening to sue you for defamation if you continue to tell people about what happened. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't record anything, and I didn't misrepresent myself. I just didn't volunteer information that I didn't think was relevant to dating someone. Jennifer made a sound like she was grinding her teeth. I know, and they know you didn't do anything wrong, but they're panicking because this could destroy their reputations and their daughter's social standing, so they're going on the offensive. They want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for dropping any complaints against the sorority. They're offering a generous donation to a charity of your choice. I almost laughed. They're trying to bribe me to be quiet about what they did? Essentially, yes. I could hear Jennifer typing. I've drafted a response declining their offer and making it clear that any further attempts at intimidation will be met with legal action. I've also been in contact with the university's general counsel. They're very interested in this case, particularly given the Caldwell Foundation's history with USC and the fact that you're a donor-affiliated individual who was subjected to this treatment on university property. She paused. Jason, I need to ask you something. How far do you want to take this? If we push forward with the formal complaint and the university investigation, this is going to become very public. The news outlets will pick it up because it involves Greek life, wealthy families, and a foundation with your family's name recognition. The other families involved will fight back hard. It could get ugly. I thought about it for a long moment. I could take the money, sign the NDA, walk away quietly, and let them continue their toxic tradition with the next guy who wasn't born into the right family. Or I could stand up for every person they'd ever humiliated, every boyfriend they'd deemed unworthy, every person who didn't have the resources to fight back. I want to take it as far as it needs to go, I said. They need to face consequences for their behavior, and other people need to know what really happens behind those doors. The formal complaint was filed on a Wednesday. By Friday, the story had leaked to the student newspaper. By the following Monday, it was on local news. USC sorority accused of hazing and humiliation of members' boyfriends, the headline read. The article detailed my complaint and referenced the 3 previous complaints that had been filed but dismissed. It mentioned that I was affiliated with a major foundation, but didn't initially name me or my family, though my anonymity lasted about 36 hours before someone connected the dots and my name started circulating. The university's investigation kicked into high gear. Dean Amanda Wallace, who oversaw student affairs and had been at USC for 12 years, called me personally to apologize for the chapter's behavior and assure me they were taking the matter seriously. She said they'd interviewed the other complainants from previous years, all of whom confirmed similar experiences. One guy had been questioned for 4 hours about why he thought he was good enough to date a Kappa Delta Phi when he was on financial aid and working 2 part-time jobs to pay for school. Another had been mocked for his clothes, his accent, and his family background. His parents were immigrants from Vietnam. The third had been asked point-blank how much money he made and told he should consider whether he could afford to date someone from the chapter given the lifestyle expectations. The investigation revealed text messages between chapter members where they discussed upcoming boyfriend interrogations, rating the guys on a scale of 1 to 10 based on their perceived social status and financial prospects, and making jokes about charity cases, their term for boyfriends who didn't meet their wealth standards. Sloan had texted the group chat the day before my interrogation. Madison's boyfriend tonight. He works at a hardware store, LOL. This is going to be entertaining. Someone asked him about his investment portfolio. Another sister had responded, Ew, why is she with him? She could do so much better. The text messages were damning. They showed clear intent to humiliate and demean, a pattern of elitist behavior, and a culture of entitlement that violated pretty much every principle the university claimed to uphold. Dean Wallace sent me copies of the relevant texts, with personal information redacted, as part of the investigation's evidence gathering, and I forwarded everything to Jennifer Torres. The university's sanctions came down in early November, about 3 weeks after my formal complaint. Kappa Delta Phi was placed on immediate suspension, meaning they could not participate in any Greek life activities, recruitment, or social events for a minimum of 2 years. The chapter's officers, including Sloan Whitmore, were removed from their positions and faced individual disciplinary action, ranging from academic probation to suspension from school. The house itself remained property of the university and the chapter, but they were required to implement mandatory anti-discrimination training and revise their bylaws to explicitly prohibit interrogations, humiliation, or any activity designed to evaluate whether someone was worthy based on socioeconomic status. Sloan was suspended for 1 semester. Aubrey and Tiffany were placed on probation. Madison was not disciplined because she'd been a victim of her own chapter's culture, though I would argue that sitting silently while your friends abuse your boyfriend makes you complicit, not a victim. The National Kappa Delta Phi organization released a statement condemning the chapter's behavior and announcing they were reviewing policies across all chapters to prevent similar incidents. Several media outlets picked up the story. The Los Angeles Times ran a piece about elitism in Greek life. Inside Higher Ed published an article about the intersection of wealth, status, and belonging in university social organizations. I was quoted anonymously in both, talking about how the experience had revealed the worst aspects of privilege and entitlement. The attention put pressure on other universities to examine their own Greek life cultures, and several schools announced they were implementing new oversight measures. The Whitmore family's attempts to intimidate me had completely backfired. Instead of silencing the story, their aggressive legal posturing had drawn more attention to it. Catherine Whitmore faced backlash in her own social circles for how she'd handled the situation. Apparently, several other parents of Kappa Delta Phi members were furious with her for making it worse and drawing media attention to something they'd have preferred to keep quiet. Madison tried to reach out 3 more times over the following month. The first was a long email apologizing and saying she'd been wrong to stay silent, that she'd been too concerned about fitting in and maintaining her status in the chapter, and that she realized now how toxic the whole culture had been. She said she was leaving the sorority and transferring to a different school because she couldn't face the judgment and the whispers. I didn't respond. The second contact was a handwritten letter delivered to my apartment. I still don't know how she got my address. In it, she said she'd thought she loved me, but realized she'd been too immature to understand what real love meant. Real love, she wrote, meant defending someone even when it's uncomfortable, standing up for what's right even when it costs you something. She said watching me walk out that night had been the wake-up call she needed about who she'd become. She said she was sorry, and she hoped someday I'd be able to forgive her. I kept the letter but didn't respond. The third contact was through my mother, which was bold and also showed a fundamental misunderstanding of boundaries. Madison sent a letter to the Caldwell Foundation addressed to my mother, asking her to pass along a message. In it, Madison asked if there was any way we could talk, just for closure, because she was struggling with guilt about what had happened. My mother called me and asked what I wanted her to do. I said to send a polite response thanking Madison for her letter, but explaining that I'd moved on and wished her well, but wasn't interested in further contact. My mother said she'd take care of it, and she did. Madison didn't contact me again after that. The fallout continued for months. The university's decision to suspend Kappa Delta Phi made national news in Greek life circles, and it sparked debates on campuses across the country about whether sororities and fraternities had become too focused on status and exclusivity. Several universities implemented new rules prohibiting chapters from screening members' romantic partners. The Kappa Delta Phi National Organization sent representatives to USC to work with the chapter on cultural reform. They instituted new member education about inclusion, respect, and the difference between tradition and hazing. They required all current members to complete diversity and inclusion training before they could be considered for reinstatement. Some members quit rather than comply. Others stayed, and, according to reports I heard through the university grapevine, actually started to understand why what they'd done was wrong. Sloan Whitmore's semester suspension meant she missed recruiting for several internships she'd been counting on. She ended up having to stay an extra semester to make up credits, which delayed her graduation. Her reputation was damaged enough that some of the finance firms she'd been targeting for jobs decided she wasn't a good culture fit. Ironic, given that she'd used that same phrase to describe me. Aubrey transferred to a different school to escape the stigma. Tiffany stayed but kept a very low profile. As for me, I eventually told my boss at Anderson Hardware what had happened. His name was Frank Delgado, and he'd been running the store for 23 years. When I explained the whole situation, his eyes went wide. "Wait," he said. "You're telling me you're actually rich and you've been working here for 3 years because you wanted to learn what real work was like?" I nodded. "And these sorority girls spent 3 hours mocking you for working here?" I nodded again. Frank started laughing, that deep belly laugh that meant something was genuinely funny. "Jason, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're a great employee. You show up on time, you help customers, you know the inventory better than anyone. The fact that you don't need the money but you come in anyway just makes you more valuable, not less." He shook his head. "Those girls are idiots." I appreciated that. Frank had never treated me differently because of my age or my education level or anything else. He'd just judged me on whether I did good work, which I tried to do. After the news coverage died down and the university's sanctions were in place, I sat down with my parents for a long conversation. We met at their house in Pacific Palisades, the one I'd grown up in, the one I'd left because I wanted to experience life without the cushion of family wealth. My dad asked me if I was going to keep working at the hardware store or if I was ready to join the family business. I told him I wasn't sure yet. I'd learned a lot from working there, from interacting with customers who were trying to fix things themselves because they couldn't afford to hire contractors, from understanding how most people budget and prioritize spending, from seeing how hard Frank worked to keep the store profitable in a world of big-box retailers. My mother said she was proud of me for standing up to Madison's sorority, for filing the complaint even when it would have been easier to walk away, for not letting them use our family's foundation as a shield for their bad behavior. She said the whole experience had made her rethink some of the foundation's giving priorities. They'd been donating to Greek life because she'd had positive experiences in her own sorority decades ago, but maybe that money could be better spent on scholarships and programs that didn't have built-in hierarchies of exclusivity. I told her that seemed like a good idea. We decided that the Caldwell Foundation would continue to honor its existing commitments to USC Greek life, but would shift future giving toward first-generation college students and programs promoting economic diversity on campus. My mother wrote a letter to the university's president explaining the decision, and it was gracious but pointed. She noted that while Greek life had value for many students, the foundation's mission was to support educational opportunity regardless of social status or family background, and recent events had highlighted the need to focus resources where they could make the most impact. The letter was CC'd to the Greek life coordinator and the dean of students. I heard through the grapevine that it caused some panic in the development office, which had been counting on continued Caldwell Foundation support. 6 months after the interrogation incident, I was still working at Anderson Hardware, still living in my studio apartment, still driving my old Camry. But I'd also started taking business classes at night and working on a plan to start my own home repair service, focusing on affordable handyman work for low-income neighborhoods. I wanted to use what I'd learned at the hardware store to build something that served people who really needed it, not just another business that catered to people who could already afford whatever they wanted. My dad was supportive. He offered to help with startup capital, but I told him I wanted to do this on my own, at least at first. If I failed, I'd know it was because of my own mistakes, not because I hadn't had enough money thrown at it. If I succeeded, I'd know it was because I'd built something real. He respected that. My mom suggested I could run the business through the foundation as a charitable program, but I said no. I wanted it to be self-sustaining, to prove that you could serve underserved communities and still build a viable business model. She respected that too. The plan was coming together slowly, and I was okay with that. I'd spent 3 years learning what I needed to learn, and now I was ready to build something with that knowledge. I ran into Madison one more time, about 8 months after everything happened. I was at a coffee shop near campus, the same one where we'd first met, and she walked in with a group of friends I didn't recognize. She saw me, hesitated, then came over alone. "Hi," she said quietly. "Can I sit for a minute?" I nodded at the empty chair. She sat down, and we looked at each other in silence for a moment. She looked different, less polished, more uncertain, like she'd lost some of the confidence that came from always being part of the right group. "I transferred to Berkeley," she said. Fresh start, away from all the drama here. I nodded. How is it? Better. Different. I joined some volunteer organizations instead of Greek life. I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not worried about what everyone thinks of me. She smiled sadly. It's harder than I expected. I could believe that. I really am sorry about that night, she continued. I've replayed it in my head about 1,000 times. All the things I should have said. All the ways I should have defended you. I was a coward, and you deserved better. I appreciated the apology, but it didn't change what had happened. You were worried about fitting in, I said. I get it. But yeah, I did deserve better. She nodded. For what it's worth, walking away from you was the stupidest thing I've ever done. You're a good person, Jason. I hope you know that. I did know that, and I also knew that Madison had learned a hard lesson about the cost of caring too much about what other people think. We talked for a few more minutes, casual conversation about school and life, and what we were both doing now. Then her friends signaled they were leaving, and she said goodbye and walked away, and I went back to my coffee and my laptop where I'd been working on financial projections for my business plan. The encounter was fine, friendly even, but it reinforced something I'd realized months ago. Madison and I were never going to work out because we wanted fundamentally different things from life. She wanted to fit into a world where status and connections and the right last name mattered. I wanted to build a life where those things didn't define me. Neither was wrong, exactly, but they weren't compatible. A year after the interrogation, Kappa Delta Phi's suspension was lifted after they completed all required reforms and demonstrated changed behavior. The new chapter president gave an interview to the student newspaper about how the suspension had been a wake-up call and how they'd learned and grown from the experience. I read the article and hoped it was true, that they'd actually changed and not just learned to hide their elitism better. Time would tell. Dr. Nguyen sent me an email thanking me for my willingness to come forward and letting me know that the university had implemented new policies as a result of the investigation. All Greek life organizations were now required to have oversight for social activities involving non-members, and any kind of screening or interrogation of members' romantic partners was explicitly prohibited. Violations would result in immediate suspension. My business, Caldwell Home Services, launched on a Saturday in June. We started small, just me and 2 other guys I'd hired from Anderson Hardware who wanted to learn business skills while doing honest work. Frank was supportive and even let me keep working part-time at the store while I built the business up. The first few months were tough, finding clients, building a reputation, figuring out pricing that was affordable for our target market, but still covered costs. But gradually, word spread. We focused on neighborhoods where people needed help but couldn't afford the rates charged by established contractors. We did small repairs, maintenance, basic improvements that made homes safer and more comfortable. We charged fair prices, and we showed up when we said we would, and we treated our clients with respect, regardless of their income level. The business grew. By the end of the first year, we had 5 employees and more work than we could handle. By the end of the second year, we'd expanded to 3 neighborhoods and had a waiting list. The business was profitable, sustainable, and actually helping people who needed it. I felt prouder of that than I'd ever felt about my trust fund. My dad asked me once if I regretted the way things had gone down with Madison and the sorority. I thought about it and said no. The whole experience had taught me important lessons about who I was and who I wanted to be. It had shown me that wealth didn't make someone valuable, and that the people who judged others based on their bank accounts were missing the point of life entirely. It had taught me that standing up for yourself and others, even when it's uncomfortable and expensive and publicly messy, was worth doing. And it had led me to start a business that actually mattered to me, that served people who needed serving, that made me feel like I was contributing something real to the world. The last I heard, Sloan was working in finance in New York. Aubrey had gone to graduate school, and Tiffany was doing social media marketing for a lifestyle brand. Madison was still at Berkeley, according to her Instagram, which I checked once out of curiosity, and seemed to be doing well. The Kappa Delta Phi chapter at USC was still active, but had supposedly reformed their culture, though I wouldn't know personally. I'd moved on completely from that world, that night, that version of myself who'd been willing to sit through 3 hours of judgment because I wanted to make a relationship work with someone who didn't value me enough to defend me. Looking back, the whole interrogation experience was one of the best things that ever happened to me, in a weird way. It clarified everything. It showed me that hiding who I was to avoid judgment didn't work because people would judge me anyway based on superficial things. It showed me that real relationships required people to stand up for each other even when it was hard. It showed me that privilege and entitlement could make people cruel and small-minded. And it showed me that I had the strength to walk away from situations that didn't serve me, even when it meant being alone, even when it meant facing public scrutiny, even when it meant upending my life. 3 years after that Saturday night in October, I was 30 years old, running a successful business that employed 15 people, and dating a woman I'd met through volunteer work who knew exactly who I was and what I came from and didn't care about any of it. She loved me for who I was, not what I had. That was worth more than any trust fund. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.